Hail travelers, I'm the Human Floyd, and you're watching part 4 of the Role-Playing Beginner's Guide to the Elder Scrolls Online. In the previous videos, we've looked at how to create a character and the basics of role-playing. In this video, we'll take a brief look at RP etiquette. I'm not the type of person to care much about standards or social rules. I mean, everything on this video is something that I've done at one point or another. But I've found that my RP experience is way more involved, friendly, and fulfilling by avoiding these habits. I've said it before and I'll say it again. There is no wrong way to roleplay. But there are certain things you can do that most roleplayers would consider unskillful or even downright rude. Many new RPers make these mistakes, not realizing that the RP community has its own etiquette and social standards, just like any type of game. My goal with this video is to help educate people about what other RPers consider poor practice and the reasons why. My friend here is going to help us out today. Everyone, this is Onlard Neirdness. He's going to be meeting up with one of my guildies in the Rift for some roleplay. This looks okay so far, but it's a little hard to understand what Onlard is saying. Like I said in the last video, some RPers care more about grammar, punctuation, and spelling than others, but you should at least be able to understand what people are saying. Seasoned Shadow asks Onlard what brought him to the tavern. Onlard responds by saying that he's questing, trying to get to level 4. He's just broken character. Real people don't have levels. Characters in Lord of the Rings or even in the Elder Scrolls games don't go around talking about what level they are or what quests they're doing. This is OOC information. Part of role-playing is simulation, pretending to exist in another world, imagining and acting like Tamriel is a real place. By talking about quests and levels, Onlard is mixing IC and OOC and therefore damaging what most role-players call immersion. Immersion is just what it sounds like, how immersed you are in the game world. Things like good graphics, sound effects, and lighting all help make you feel more like you're in the world of Tamriel. Role-playing is the ultimate form of immersion. By acting like a person living in the Elder Scrolls universe, and interacting with other people who are also participating in this simulation, role-players submerge themselves into a fantasy world, taking a journey through our imaginations. But when a character suddenly starts talking OOC, like Onlard in his aspirations to get to level 4, the immersion is lost, and suddenly it's not a fantasy world, but just another video game. Let's see how Seasoned Shadow reacts to this breach of RP etiquette. He does well, considering his immersion was just shattered with the OOC hammer. Deciding to just roll with it, he asks Onlard if the 4th level is some kind of religious practice. This is a skillful way of remaining in character while still acknowledging what Onlard said. And then Onlard has to go and mess it up again. He says that he worships Talos. Aside from the fact that Talos is a human god, and no elf in his right mind would worship him, there's another problem. Talos is from the previous Elder Scrolls games, like Skyrim or Oblivion. But Elder Scrolls Online actually takes place a few hundred years before Talos was born. So he's not even alive yet, much less a god someone could worship. This is a perfect example of why researching your lore is necessary. There's no way Onlard would even know who Talos is. Seas continues to keep it classy and roll with the punches. But then our Dunmer friend goes and Onlards it up. Having your character be the child of an important character from the game's story is not often accepted by most roleplayers. This might seem odd at first, but the reason actually makes a lot of sense in my opinion. You see, if Onlard's character is the love child of Talos and Almalexia, both very famous, very significant characters in Elder Scrolls lore, then he'd be written about in the history books. Every person, every roleplayer in Tamriel would know who he is, which obviously isn't the case, so it makes his backstory totally illegitimate. But say that his familial ties are secret. Even if this relationship is something that's been kept from the world, you're still essentially writing yourself into the lore by claiming it. One of the values many roleplayers share is respect for someone else's writing. We don't work for Bethesda or ZeniMax, so we can't just write for the characters which are their intellectual property. By claiming to have an intimate connection to one of these characters, you are altering the story of Elder Scrolls. Most people don't see that as anyone's right but the developers, and will not accept such alterations into their own roleplay. Roleplayers who do this seem to think that it'll make their characters cooler or more interesting, but there are plenty of ways to make a cool character that are much more creative and not so overused. Seasoned Shadow chuckles and makes a sarcastic remark to the silly Dark Elf. This reaction is about what you can expect from most roleplayers if you try to tell them that your character is someone of great importance. Again, Onlard makes a bold claim. He says he is a champion. In the Elder Scrolls universe, this term is used to refer to a great hero, usually the main character of the story. Even though everyone plays through the main story of the game and is referred to as champion of this or savior of that, roleplaying changes all of it. Since the game's story is more or less the same experience for every single player, we can't all claim to have done every single quest and defeated Molag Bal ourselves. It just doesn't make any sense. That's why roleplayers come up with our own backstories completely separate from the character called Vestige, who seeks to reclaim his or her soul. Now, it should be noted that some roleplayers will choose to roleplay as the Vestige who defeated Molag Bal, or the Mages Guild hero who worked alongside the legendary Shalador, and that's totally fine. But many roleplayers will see that as too important a role for one person to claim, and won't acknowledge it. Onlard, use the wit. He asks the Argonian what it's like to be a vampire. Now, Seasoned Shadow's character is a vampire, yes. Looking closely, you can see his pale white scales and red eyes beneath his hood. But see how he's wearing that face mask? The player has obviously taken measures to disguise his character. Even though OOC, we know that he is a vampire, he is roleplaying that his character is disguised. If he wasn't, the Nord NPCs in the tavern would all take out their weapons and try to kill him. It's completely up to you to judge whether or not your character can see through another character's disguise. Maybe your character is a vampire hunter and very experienced. But just outright knowing something about another character like this without even thinking about it or reasoning it out is called metagaming. Metagaming is when your character knows things that they shouldn't, things they're only aware of because you know them, OOC, as the player. Roleplaying is a game of the mind. It takes thought, consideration, and logic. 3 things Onlard could work on. And now Onlard is attacking Seas. Realistically, the tavern owner would throw them out. But Onlard doesn't seem to care, slashing his sword at the Argonian. Here he makes a mistake called god-modding or god-moding, depending on who you ask. He wrote, Onlard slashes his sword and cuts your arm. By automatically cutting Seasoned Shadow's arm, Onlard is playing God. Remember that bit about respecting other people's writing? With that concept comes the often unspoken rule that you do not control someone else's character. Whether or not they get injured is up to them. Obviously, there is a ton of room for abuse here. Roleplay fights notoriously end up in OOC arguments. In the future, I'd like to create a video on how to turn a roleplay fight into a fun experience that everyone walks away happy about. There's also a link below to a short written guide that I put together on RP fights. Just know that god-modding, auto-hitting, and using overpowered abilities with nothing but the idea of winning in mind is not a good way to make any friends or have fun roleplaying. A roleplay fight should be a cooperative writing exercise, not a competition. Seasoned Shadow, with the patience of a saint, casts a rune prison spell. Notice he doesn't say whether or not the spell succeeds in capturing the psychotic Dunmer. This is the most accepted way of going about a roleplay fight. It allows the other player to choose whether the spell affects them or not. A good roleplayer will both take and dodge hits, playing it fair. Onlard, on the other hand, happens to be a master of wards, as well as a giant muscular, fireball-slinging sword wielder, blocking the ability somehow. Without missing a beat, he instantly casts an enormous fireball at Seasoned Shadow, knocking him into the wall. Finally, the Argonian has had enough. He reveals his vampire nature by vaporizing into a cloud of mist and fleeing the tavern. Let's review some of the no-nos. Breaking character. Talking OOC and /say, or making out-of-game comments. There are OOC channels to talk out of character in. Many roleplayers use tabs to separate their IC and OOC conversations, so they can be more immersed in their roleplay. Many guild chats are OOC, and most people consider whispers and group chat to be OOC as well. Zone chat is always out of character. To avoid breaking character, imagine your roleplay is an epic fantasy film. If Gandalf suddenly turned to Aragorn and said, "Dude, Sauron is so retarded, we should PvP him," it might disrupt the feel of the movie a bit. The same goes for roleplay. Breaking lore. Outright changing, contradicting, or ignoring lore. Lore exists so that we're all speaking a common language, playing in a consistent game world. If everyone just altered the lore to their will, we wouldn't be playing in the Elder Scrolls setting anymore. I don't know about you, but I signed up for ESO to play some Elder Scrolls, not something else. To avoid breaking lore, just read up on it. Metagaming. Using out-of-character information to affect your in-character actions. Other examples of this would be knowing things about another character just because you read their profile, or your character having lore knowledge that is supposed to be secret to the world. To avoid metagaming, be mindful of what your character actually knows and doesn't know. Try to see things from their eyes. God-modding/God moding. Controlling someone else's character or the situation. Emoting someone else's character in any way is considered God-modding. To say that their character is happy, sad, intimidated, wounded, or anything else like that is God-modding. You wouldn't want someone to do it to you, so don't do it to them. While emoting for the environment or NPCs is perfectly acceptable, doing so in an abusive way that just furthers the goals of your own character is also considered God-modding. To avoid it, just focus on what your character is doing and what they are attempting to accomplish. But remember that roleplay is a collaborative group effort. It should be noted that many roleplayers use game masters or GMs in their RP. Guild leaders are often also game masters, controlling the environment and the NPCs more than a roleplayer normally would for the sake of creating a fun story for other roleplayers to play out. This is probably the only example of when God-modding would be acceptable. I'll talk more about game masters in a future video. Auto-hitting. Automatically landing every attack in an RP fight. By emoting that your attack has hit another player's character, you are taking control away from them. The common agreement that holds RP together is that we each play and control our own characters. Maybe that's not entirely realistic, but it's the only way to keep things fair. To avoid auto-hitting, always phrase any emote directed at another player as a suggestion or attempt, giving them the option to accept or reject it. We've all been in OnLard. The longer you roleplay, the more fine-tuned your style becomes. You learn what actions tend to lead to roleplay that is more fun and engaging versus roleplay that is boring, unfulfilling, or pointless. In my personal experience, these things we've demonstrated almost always lead to OOC squabbling rather than good roleplay. RP is a skill that develops with practice and experience, just like anything else. OnLard may be a little rough around the edges, but he's willing to learn, and that's what will help him become a great roleplayer someday. I hope this video has been useful to you. In the next and final part of this RP Beginner's Guide, I'm going to offer advice and tips on finding roleplay and getting more involved in both storylines and the community as a whole. I've been the Human Floyd. As always, thanks for watching, and peace.